So let's start building our stakeholder model. The first step is the project. Once you have a project, the next step is to define the stakeholders. And as I've said, it could be customers, it could be suppliers, it could be government agencies or local municipalities. It could be all kinds of groups or individuals who are stakeholders for your project. And as I've said before, I recommend doing this with some kind of brainstorming activity. If you have a large group of people working in your stakeholder workshop, then you might want to use Post-it notes. Let each person write down one stakeholder on a Post-it note, as many as they can come up with, and then put them up on the whiteboard and start grouping them together. When you're satisfied that you have all the possible stakeholders identified, then we start developing an understanding of the relationship between the stakeholder and the project. And I'd usually start with asking what we expect that stakeholder to contribute to the project. Now keep in mind, all stakeholders don't necessarily contribute something, but we start by asking that question. Look at each stakeholder and ask, what would we expect them to contribute to the project in order for the project to be a success? Once we've understood how each stakeholder is expected to contribute to the project, if they're expected to contribute to the project, then we can ask ourselves the question if the stakeholder will gain some benefit from the project. Now, some stakeholders will both be expected to contribute and benefit. There may be some stakeholders that only expect to benefit from the project, or some that will only contribute. So now we've defined the stakeholders, we've defined what they're expected to contribute and what they're expected to benefit. One little footnote is that sometimes we have to think about the relationship between two stakeholders. I've been involved in projects where there might be different organizations sponsoring a project, and both of those organizations have based their money, their contribution, contingent on that the other organization also puts in money. So then I have to understand the relationship between those two parties in order to get both of them, because if I don't get both, I don't get anything. So sometimes there can be situations that arise that I need to also understand the relationship between two stakeholders. I've also seen examples where two stakeholders simply won't work together. They won't be involved in the same project. And that's an important insight to have early on that you don't discover it later in the project. Keep in mind that if you're involved in a very large project, there could be a number of different stakeholder models that you use. One at the highest level of the project, but then you could break it down into smaller stakeholder models. For example, if you think about organizing a big event, like a giant rock concert, you might have one big stakeholder model for the whole concert, the whole event. But then you might have a smaller sub-project and a sub-stakeholder model for the people working with sanitation, or the people working with entertainment, or the people working with security, or the people working with food. So you could have a number of stakeholder models that break down the bigger stakeholder model. Now we've done a stakeholder model. We've identified the project, identified all the stakeholders involved in the project. We've described how each stakeholder is affected by the project. In other words, what their interest is in the project in form of benefit or contribution that they're expected to make. So now we'll move on to the next step.